observed that the University of Iowa State quantifies that the price of IoT sensors dropped 40 times over the past 10 years and is now at a mere 80 cents. Contention 1 is renewable energy. U.S. News finds that climate change makes countries more prone to natural disasters and crop failures, which will cause over 100 million deaths by 2030. According to the Japan Times, any plausible game plan to stop global warming depends on replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy. However, traditional grid systems that use renewable energy do not work. According to Stuyvesant Corporation, when sunlight rapidly increases or the wind speed changes all of a sudden, rapid fluctuations in power load cause a host of problems, damaging the grid. Just a single millisecond of instability can wreak havoc. The Institute for Energy Research corroborates that just a moment of unstable energy supply can cost more than $10,000 in damages. The Internet of Things sensors uniquely solve this problem. Comanche CSS explains that IoT connected grids consist of sensors collecting data and control structures that analyze it. This makes grid able to automatically adapt to power fluctuations and preventing grid damage. Fortunately, Greenpeace explains that IoT is ready to be applied to a large-scale energy distribution and is already used in some places. For instance, Kell University finds smart grids in Italy deliver annual savings of 500 million euros. The impact will only get larger. Greenpeace finds that with IoT, the world's electricity can be 70% renewable by 2050. Contention 2 is healthcare. The Internet of Things is already revolutionizing medical care today. The Business Insider reports that the Internet of Things related to healthcare is a $59 billion industry, and the Internet of Things is only expected to grow. As healthcare data finds that the number of individuals being monitored by IoT devices will increase fourfold by 2020 worldwide. Subpoint A is remote monitoring. According to RTI, in hospitals without the Internet of Things, dozens of devices all operate independently, leaving no uniform way to interpret data and understand patient status. Because of this inconsistency, accidents happen, data is misunderstood, and dangerous conditions go unaddressed. Child of the Washington Post concludes that every year, human error in hospital claims 250,000 lives. Fortunately, not only have Freescale explains that IoT sensors replace subjective human observation of patients, providing doctors with a constant objective flow of information. The benefits of IoT healthcare extend beyond hospital walls. Co-negative Sword research center explains that wearable technology can easily function beyond the intensive care unit and alert doctors to any problems the patient may develop. According to the Internet of Business, the IoT reduces the cost of medical care because wearable devices stop patients from needing to return for minor reasons. In fact, Maniaki of the McKinsey Global Institute calculates that the Internet of Things reduces the cost of treating a chronic disease patient by 20%. The results are undeniably positive. Looking at nearly 2 million infant medical records, West of Berkman's institution finds that when sensors are used to monitor fetuses and newborns, infant mortality drops by 53%. When he projects the expanded use of this technology, Koenig quantified smart wearable devices will save an astounding 1.3 million lives by 2020. Subpoint B is vaccines. According to NextLeap Analytics, over 2.4 million children die each year as a result of vaccine-preventable diseases. This happens because, according to Craig Montgomery, 25% of vaccines spoil before they ever reach their recipients. The National Center for Biotechnical Information explains that vaccines are temperature sensitive, which means that exposure to extreme temperatures can make a vaccine unusable. Unfortunately, retrograde refrigeration and power outages make it especially hard to deliver vaccines in developing countries. Luckily, placing Internet of Things temperature sensors in refrigerators can solve this issue in 2 ways. First is accommodating for poor machinery. Jody Robertson of Washington University writes that poorly functional refrigeration deviate from the target temperature range and expose vaccines to freezing temperatures. In fact, you find between 75% and 100% of vaccine shipments are exposed to harmfully low temperatures. Luckily, NextLeap Analytics writes that sensors connected to the internet that cost less than $50 allow workers to be alerted via text when the temperatures inside refrigerators reach dangerous limits. They can change the temperature remotely. Second is mitigating the harms of power outages. Evolve magazine writes that real-time data monitoring of medical refrigerators is especially imperative in developing countries where power supplies are unreliable. In fact, according to Crown Junati, just last year, 400,000 vaccines spoiled in a Pakistani storage center because people were unaware of a power outage. Fortunately, Evolve writes that remote monitoring the Internet of Things sensors lets workers know when temperatures have changed to an outage, allowing them to respond quickly by transferring the vaccines or fixing the outage. For these reasons, Nicholas Fern finds the Internet of Things is revolutionizing vaccine care. NextLeap Analytics finds just one smart temperature sensor is already tracking vaccines for more than 38,000 babies born annually in India. Thus, we affirm.
So everyone ready? Sam and I negate with one observation. In order for the benefits of the Internet of Things to be experienced by those who actually need it, society must allow the disadvantaged the ability to obtain equality. Thus, in order for the affirmative team to access any benefits, they first must ensure that the technology is used in governments that value equality, or else the Internet of Things will merely benefit those in the upper class, driving a larger wedge between classes. Our sole point of contention is that Big Brother is watching. As John Zittrain of Harvard explains, the overwhelming amount of personal information floating in cyberspace from the Internet of Things raises questions about how exposed the public has become to a host of bad actors. The new intrusiveness is quantified by Gianmarco Baldini of the JRC, who writes that due to the low cost of data storage, the Internet of Things has ushered us into the industrial revolution of data, where over 90% of the world's data has been created in the past 2 years alone. Andrew Ferguson of the Berkeley Law Journal corroborates. The Internet of Things is by design a system of surveillance, creating an inescapable data web that monitors all aspects of one's life. As the trend furthers, the government can tap into this ever-increasing pool of data with virtually no regulation. This is especially harmful as the governments gain access to the web of data. Accessing just one device enables the government to monitor dozens of facets of an individual's life. A 2015 Ernst & Young report explains that we are living in an internet of insecure things, creating the perfect breeding ground for mass intrusions due to hyperconnectivity between devices. The premise of the government using the Internet of Things as a tool for mass oversight is problematic as it poses two unique harms to democracy. First, it erodes democratic principles and free nations. According to Catherine Beckett of the University of Washington, while surveillance on the whole is rising, monitoring of minorities has increased far more, which she finds to be the main reason for massive disparities and incarceration rates today. Kama Waddell of The Atlantic corroborates that big data is used predatorily to discriminate against individuals in low-income communities. This notion is supported by Michael Chertoff of the ACLU, who reports that African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be surveilled by their government, proportionally increasing their chance of being jailed. This makes them unable to participate in elections, creating a system in which the disadvantaged cannot affect politics and their marginalization quickly becomes entrenched in a self-perpetuating cycle. Martin Rem of the University of Twente furthers, finding that decreased political participation and voter turnout pose one of the largest threats to democracy itself, as it allows abuses of the disadvantaged groups to be perpetuated when government stops being representative of the entire population. As David Line of Queen's University summarizes, surveillance is not only a contemporary threat to individual freedoms, but also a powerful means of creating and reinforcing long-term social differences. Second, it prevents democratization in unfree nations. According to Anita Rosemary of Mannheim University, governments who feel challenged increase surveillance to suppress political dissent. The flow of big data enables governments to surveil their constituents more effectively and accurately. This constituent surveillance makes citizens wary of retribution for exposing dissent. As the PEN American Center found in a 2015 survey, 8 out of 10 writers globally are very worried about current levels of government surveillance. Subsequently, those writers reported limiting their expression, a self-silencing process known as the chilling effect. Elizabeth Stoychev of the Journal of Mass Communication corroborates, finding that government surveillance prevents the disclosure of minority opinions, reinforces the majority, and allows abusive structures to be strengthened. The poor are often suppressed, as Joseph Wright of Penn State finds that they are significantly less likely to support current leaders, making them the primary targets of silencing. Silencing the poor means they never have their needs addressed by the government, which is why Ashutosh Varney of Notre Dame finds that while democracies steadily attack poverty, authoritarian leaders have no interest in ensuring such equality. The progressive retrogression of democratic principles globally is exemplified by a 2015 Freedom House report that found that global freedoms are in decline for every year in the past decade, with the largest degradation of personal liberties just last year.
So what is the type of surveillance that's used to surveil minorities or that increases incarceration rates?
Like right now?
Yeah.
Okay, well, namely, there's a lot of predictive policing, so they go into communities, and that's why there are higher conviction rates, and thus more people are pushed in the pipeline.
So how does this is really important. Wait.
You asked a question, now it's my turn.
Can I ask a follow-up really quickly?
After I ask a question. So how much does the IoT decrease the spoiling of vaccines?
Well, we say that it's a unique solution to the spoiling vaccines. It's already been successful and will continue to be successful. It's already saved.
Can you give me a number?
Well, as we tell you that it's already saved 38,000. It's projected to save.
How much does it reduce spoil?
Well, if the vaccines never spoil, if there's a sensor that allows you to make sure that the fridge doesn't ever reach a low temperature, then that means that the vaccines never spoil. It's not like
so. Can you give me a piece of evidence saying how much?
No spoiling of the vaccine.
Yeah. So you're telling me right now 25% of them spoil. Can you tell me how much that goes down?
I can't tell you exactly how much that goes down. I can tell you that it's been effective and that it goes down significantly because this is a unique solution. Can I ask you the follow-up question?
Sure.
Okay, so how is like the IoT uniquely help the government surveil its citizens when it comes to like political
Because
dissent,
it creates more data
surveilling minorities?
The way right now that governments surveil their citizens is through the collection of data points and analyzing trends to match other people. That's why we see a lot of surveillance and a lot of discrimination based on this data. Now the IoT expands that data.
Right?
As Baldini tells us, 90% of the world's data has been created in the past 2 years.
Sure, but what is that data? Where is the IoT used most prevalently?
In homes and things.
I mean, we
right now it's in its infancy. Right now it's in its infancy, right? It's expected to grow over the years, and as it's expected to grow, it's expected to be used as
it's been around for 10 years.
Yeah, but it's still in its infancy. At the point where 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 2 years alone,
but what is that data? I'm trying to get to the fact that this data is not meaningful data that helps governments suppress dissidents. It doesn't really help them surveil minorities. Because why does the government care how I like my toast, right?
No, but not just whatever your toaster says. It's they analyze trends that things like your energy consumption, and they discriminate on you based on that. Things like that.
How does that lead to
possibilities are endless, but I'm gonna ask you a question.
Silencing dissidents.
Okay.
So this is really important.
How much does the IoT decrease blackouts?
What?
How much does the IoT decrease blackouts of the energy grid?
I can't tell you exactly how much the IoT.
Here's the problem. You give us a lot of
I can tell
problems.
them a unique solution to this problem.
Okay, but you're not quantifying the solution. You're not explaining that solution.
We tell you that it's being used right now. We've given you the success rate so far and the projected success rates. That's all we can do insofar as it's not being.
If the price of energy is going down, what does that do for consumers? What do consumers do? If the price of energy is decreasing, you're saying the renewable energy integration of low cost sources.
It's just going to be straight down the case. So everyone ready? Start off on their first contention when they talk about Big Brother. They're simply out of touch with reality. The reality of how IoT is being implemented is they're mostly small sensors and data chips that are 40% of which are in industries, like in factories, a further 30% are in healthcare. At that point, the data they gather is completely useless. Means the government cannot surveil on how much energy my company uses or my sleep cycles. So at that point, one, it never proved to you. They say the surveillance is really, really bad and how IoT is a bad form of surveillance. They never proved to you that governments are actually going to use it. They don't give you a single empirical example of where this is being implemented. If anything, we say that governments have no interest in using this type of data, which is why the IoT has been around for 19 years. They don't give you a single empirical example of a single surveillance program that is based off of the IoT. But now let's move on to their first warrant, but they specifically talk about democracy. Firstly is they're talking about governments discriminating because now they have access to more information. But the government has access right now in the status quo to literally every form of information that they possibly would need to discriminate. They have census records, which gives them access to your gender, your race. They have access to tax records, which is records on your social economic status. There's literally no more other information they can possibly use to discriminate against you. Many of the problems that they talk about, such as predictive policing or discrimination like redlining, have existed in the past, have no relationship or correlation whatsoever to IoT surveillance, have to prove to you how IoT uniquely make this worse. But second, to quantify to you how much worse will the IoT make this? Is it a marginal impact increase of a 0.1%? What does that necessarily do for the quality of life of people in democracies? But thirdly, truth outright that the battle for privacy in these large democracies are already been fought and already been lost. There's literally 13 large-scale surveillance programs in the United States alone, like NSA surveillance, but it goes through much more personal data, like your Facebook posts and your emails, than how much energy or your smart toaster uses. That's really important because we have access to your real-time GPS tracking data. There's much more personal data that's being accessed in the status quo without the IoT. So if there is indeed a bright line to privacy being lost, we probably already reached that bright line. If we hasn't, they don't prove to you how much closer we get to the bright line because of the IoT. Their impact is a decrease in political participation. But first, this is empirically untrue. After the United States, Edward Snowden exposed our surveillance programs, we did not decrease political participation. If anything, political participation went up because even if the citizen democracies are less likely to speak out, we can still silently vote. They never prove to you why citizen democracies are one, less likely to speak out, two, why we can't just go to the voting booth and vote. But now let's consider the second warrant where we talk about authoritarianism. Firstly, they give you no empirical examples. If anything, Freedom House writes that autocracy is on the rise in the status quo, which means that like there is literally no impact. If the possibility of people getting out of an autocracy in the status quo is already 0%, if it decreases by another like 5%, it's still 0%. There's not a net harm, right? Like autocracy has been on the rise over the past 20 years. That's like for other reasons other than the IoT, which means that we have no probability of getting out of those authoritarian regimes anyway. But thirdly, this is completely non-unique. The Guardian writes that in authoritarian regimes like Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China, they have even more extensive surveillance programs over the internet and other like much more personal aspects of surveillance. Never prove to you how an IoT will one play into this picture, or two make it worse. If there is a bright line to the impact, it's already been breached. They don't prove to you like how much worse is it going to get. Their impact is somehow we're going to see a decreased quality of life for citizens in authoritarian regimes. While they never prove to you like how much worse is it going to get. A 0.1% increase in authoritarianism, what does that mean for the people living in those countries? And I think you turn this impact, because economists tell you that authoritarian regimes are not inherently bad. If anything, they are the ones who achieve the majority of economic development over the past 50 years. The development research program tells you that over the past 50 years, the only country that is a democracy that has risen out of poverty and industrialized is Mauritius, which has a total population of less than the Bronx. That's really important because the majority of poverty reduction that we've seen are in South Korea, which industrialized under a dictatorship, China, which pulled millions of people out of poverty under a dictatorship. The second way you turn this impact is that authoritarian regimes have a greater incentive to help their people, because if their people aren't being helped, then they rebel. If their people is physically starving and they're not caring for their interests, they're going to rebel. They have an incentive to not do that.
That's it. I'll do my judges here.
Can you just give me your roadmap?
Yeah, so it's going to start off with their framework and then go down their case and then hopefully get back to mine.
Thanks.
No problem. Judges? Opponents? Garish? So they read you this framework at the top of their case that says that the price of IoT has dropped 40 times in the past 15 years. The problem is their entire case is just a lot of problems that exist in the world right now, but they never show you that the IoT is the solution. They have that burden to show that these problems that exist are actually solved by the Internet of Things technology. Insofar as in Crossfire, she cannot give you a single example of how many vaccines are safe or how many blackouts don't exist because of the Internet of Things. They fail to do that, and they cannot win this round until they meet that burden. With that in mind, let's move on to their first contention, which is all about renewable energy. Again, recognize that on face, they never show you a quantification for how much renewable energy increases, or how much blackouts decrease, or how much the cost of energy changes, but even more so recognize that inherently we are worse off concerning energy with the Internet of Things. What Energati finds is that the Internet of Things leads to more energy consumption because IoT devices are designed so they are always on. Even more so, Clint Finley of Wired in 2014 writes, the Internet of Things environmental predictions are inaccurate and inconsistent. Companies that make IoT devices don't know how much energy they will consume, and there are no energy regulations regarding IoT technology. So on face, we are moving into grounds in which there are no regulations, and companies have no way to stop using this dirty energy. But even more so, what Eric Cathcart of Earth Advantage in 2014 writes is there is no increase in efficiency on net because the Internet of Things will flood the market with billions of devices, which on net actually increases energy usage. If you value changing the way we use energy, you're not going to be affirming in today's round because we only on net increase energy usage by because the increase in efficiency is not offset by the market being flooded with new devices which are consuming even more energy. Even more so, what Orion Jones of Big Think writes is that energy efficiency is actually bad because it causes the rebound effect, as cheaper energy incentivizes increased energy usage. Even more so, this is quantified by Alex Trembath of Breakthrough, who writes in 2015 that this rebound effect was seen in Scotland, where they saw a 130% increase in energy consumption, in China, where they saw a 165% increase in energy consumption, and in Kenya, where they saw a 350% increase in energy consumption. Ted Norhouse of the Breakthrough further corroborates that several meta-analyses have concluded that increased energy efficiency increases energy consumption on average by over 100%. If you value changing the way that we use energy, affirming is certainly not the way to do it. But let's move on to their important contention, which is all about healthcare. Recognize on face in their subpoint A, they talk about how there's all these accidental deaths. They never once read you a statistic that says that IoT reduces accidents by any marginal difference. Even more so, recognize that we're really opening up Pandora's box here. What Madeline Gilman of Emory University writes is that these smart hospitals and all those IoT technology in the healthcare infrastructure would only be put into wealthy neighborhoods, which means even if there are benefits, they're only experienced by the top 10% in the political elite, and the poor are allowed to just suffer to even greater qualities, even exacerbating income inequality. Even more so, what Perrin Ploeg of the NRC finds is that data discrimination, where we gather data and subsequently make decisions about individuals without actually knowing them and acting upon our prejudices, is the worst in the healthcare industry, and that's only facilitated by big data, which is part of the IoT. But even more so, turn this argument against them, because Tom Costello of the NBC writes that hacking of healthcare records is up 11,000%. That opens the door to several settle egregious abuses of people's personal privacy. Even more so, let's go on to subpoint B, which is about vaccines. Recognize on face. They tell you how many people die because of preventable diseases. They never tell you how many lives are saved. Even more so, what Harish and I would contest, that the problem mainly is not because people don't have, or because there's not good refrigerators, but rather they don't have the money to access these vaccines in the first place. What Debbie Amendola of the Journal of Pharmaceutics finds is that the cost of vaccines has increased 68-fold in the past 13 years. It doesn't matter how cool our refrigerators are, people physically can't afford these vaccines. Even more so, this is only exemplified by Josh Hamlin of The Atlantic, who writes that just last month, Doctors Without Borders refused 1 million free vaccines from Pfizer in an effort to take a stand against rising pharmaceutical costs. But even more so, recognize from the World Bank that democracies are comparatively advantageous in immunizing their population, meaning that when you strengthen autocracies and erode the principles of democracy, you actually see a net decrease in the health of citizens. Now let's move back to our case. He reads you in response to the erosion of democracy that we never show how much worse this surveillance gets. The problem is, Harish reads you very clearly from Ernst & Young that when you get access to one device, you get access to all devices. That's the comparison to current surveillance methods.
response to my first contention, which isn't even about energy efficiency, you say that there's going to be a rebound effect. Can you explain how the rebound effect occurs when green energy prices are decreasing because of the IoT?
Explain to me why that happens.
Okay, so we say that the reason why green energy in the status quo is so expensive is because that grids get there's a lot of fluctuation with the energy level on those grids, which in turn causes huge amounts of damages. We tell you that just a few moments of fluctuation can cause $10,000 worth of damages. That's why green energy is really, really expensive in the status quo.
Wait, that's kind of like backwards, right?
Like,
explain to me why damages to a power grid increase the input cost of the thing that did that damage. Like logically. Because
if as an energy company, there's a higher risk of me losing tens of thousands of dollars because the technology is a bit volatile, I increase prices for consumers. Well, the way that IoT solves for this is that IoT sensors are implemented on the power grid, it's called a smart grid, and on these solar panels that sees if there is a sudden increase, like a drastic increase in sunlight that could cause this fluctuation, I either shut it down, I stop taking energy.
It's about increasing the efficiency of those power grids, right?
It's about increasing the efficiency of smart power grids, which is why in Italy, in Puritan, when it's been implemented, we decreased green energy prices by $500 million. Right? How does that possibly lead to an increase in fossil fuels?
Here's the thing: is you're making a smarter grid for energy as
no, it's a smarter grid for smart energy.
But that's inherently not true. All you're doing is creating a more reliable and accountable grid, which increases the efficiency and accountability of all power.
Fossil fuel energy production doesn't have this fluctuation.
I know, but when you make there's still blackouts in the United States, even when we have the majority of our power coming from things like coal and natural gas, right? So when you increase the reliability and accountability of a power grid by transitioning to a smart grid, that doesn't just have the same effect on green energy, but also on dirty energy, which is why we find when you implement the smart grid, there's a 350% increase in dirty energy consumption. But we've been talking about this for 2 minutes, so I'm going to move on. You tell us that authoritarian governments are good. Can you give me
they're not as bad as you make them out to be?
Can you give me the comparative advantage between a democracy and authoritarian government in which you ever reasonably take the latter?
The reason why The Economist tells you that.
No. I understand that authoritarian governments make their countries great again or whatever. Can you explain to me why that's better than a democracy?
Yes, because they're able to achieve more rapid industrial.
So that's offset by all the persistent human rights abuses, the withholding food and electricity from their populations.
Hold on. I am not telling you that on net they're well, I'm just saying they're not that bad.
You said you were about to turn this against them. Authoritarian governments are so good that you affirm by strengthening authoritarian governments. That's the argument that you make.
The first is that they're better able to achieve economic growth in the short term.
I don't think that anyone in this room will actually agree that in the big picture, anyone would prefer an authoritarian regime over a democratic institution.
Poverty reduction than any democracy standards.
Throw you one more prep?
Yeah. Then on to my first contention. Okay. they have a lot of problems with their contention about Big Brother is watching, because they never quantify to you how much this is going to get worse. They don't prove that we haven't already met this bright line of breach of privacy, and they don't explain to you why this is specific to that data that the IoT is gathering. With that being said, they don't access any of their impacts, but even if we did, even if you say that you see like more autocracy, we would say that that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the biggest poverty reduction that has happened has been under autocratic regimes. With that being said, let's go to our side of the case, our first contention, which is going to be really, really important. Because what we're saying here is that Japan Times tells us that the only way that we can actually solve for global warming in the long term is by making the switch to renewable energy. All of my opponents' responses are talking about increasing consumption of fossil fuels, but the issue is it doesn't matter if we are increasing the amount of energy consumption we're using if we are making the switch to renewable energy, because renewable energy is sustainable. So none of my opponents' responses actually apply, because what we're going to be doing is making green energy cheaper. Because what happens right now is stats tells us that fluctuations in weather and different environmental changes cause power outages for large grid systems, which makes them too expensive to implement, which is really bad. And when the IoT sensors are able to sense the different environmental changes and have the alert people fast enough, you're able to accommodate for those changes, and you see more switches to renewable energy, which is the only sustainable solution for climate change. They tell you that we don't show any quantification or implementation, but we tell you that right now it's being implemented. It's being implemented right now. Greenpeace tells us that it's being implemented right now and ready to be implemented in the future even more. We give you the example of Italy, and we quantify the impact for you. Greenpeace tells us that there's just going to be a 70% transition to renewable energy by 2050, specifically due to the Internet of Things. And this is the biggest impact in today's round, because it's try or die. If we don't make the switch to renewable energy, nothing matters. It doesn't matter if your regime is autocratic, if everyone's dead because of global warming. You remember US News tells us that it's going to cause 1 million deaths by 2030. This is the biggest impact today's round, because the life is something that you can never get back, and this is a problem that we can't solve for without renewable energy.
So everybody, I'll be starting on surveillance, or actually, the renewable energy. Okay, start off on the renewable energy contention. Remember, Sam gives you the evidence that the IoT is literally always on. That means those devices are literally using energy, even if they're not connected, even if like you adopt the smart grid or whatever, it's not going to matter, because all the combined effects of the IoT using more energy is clearly going to outweigh. That's why we have billions of more devices, clearly outweighs any sort of smart grid we're ever going to implement. But then on the idea of healthcare, realize she drops the evidence that Sam talks about, an 11,000% increase in hacking. That's because of increased harms. That's an increased harm to personal privacy, and that's especially harmful because then people won't want to give up their information, which prevents successful diagnoses in the future. But moreover, realize the plug analysis that Sam gives you talks about data discrimination, especially in authoritarian regimes. They have no bounds on using this data, so if you have a medical condition, someone can discriminate against you. But then let's go over surveillance. Realize we tell you from Ferguson, the Internet thinks is by design a system of surveillance. Well, they tell you, wait, this system of surveillance already exists. But that's where the Ernst & Young comes in. They literally tell you that you allow, when you just get into one device, that allows you access to all the other devices. That's quantified by Baldini, who finds that 90% of the world's data has literally been created in the last 2 years. That's the uniqueness. But then Rosemary tells you why this is harmful. She tells you that big data allows more surveillance of dissenters. Now, they tell you that those dissenters can still speak out, but they completely ignore the chilling effect, which Stuy tells us that surveillance prevents the disclosure of minority opinions because of fear of government retribution. At that point, governments no longer have accountability to their people because no one's speaking out against them. So when he tells you that there's economic growth in authoritarian regimes, that's literally at the expense of those on the bottom, because those on the bottom never get the energy they need. They never get the vaccines they need. Even if the IoT technology does exist, the government simply aren't providing it for them. But then lastly, he tries to tell you that we have more extensive surveillance right now. That proves our point. That literally proves the willingness of governments to use more data to increase surveillance in the future. At the end of the day, discrimination is a gateway right. Equal protection is a gateway right. You can't access anything without it.
Y'all want to prep for Grant? All right, let's go.
Okay, so how many people die as a result of increased hacking or like discrimination?
I'm not really sure. I mean, I would say that like Harish gives the analysis in summary that like when you have like your healthcare records hacked, you're like less likely to trust like
But like you
medical
don't have like any
systems.
sort of like meaningful impact of this like quantification of it, right?
I mean, if you want to talk quantifications, I feel like that kind of opens up a much larger discussion about like the lack of them in your case.
I mean, we give you like pretty clear quantifications in our case. We tell you like there's going to be a 70% reduction of it, switch to renewable energies by 2050. We give you the quantification
Yeah,
of
but what does that
countries
do?
using it and like.
What does that do?
What do you mean, what does that do? Renewable energy? We tell you that it's the only way to like solve for global warming and like have a sustainable energy solution.
Yeah,
It's a
but
really
like
big, important
you
thing.
never like you tell us that like renewable energy is the way to do this, but you never also tell us that IoT is the way to cross the right.
That's our whole first contention.
No, you just tell me that there's a 70% increase in renewable energy. How like
Wait,
what's
explain-
the
okay, you want
increase
us
in
to
renewable
explain
energy
the
that we need to
contention?
hit to like save the world?
What?
What's the increase in renewable energy, like the bright line that needs to be crossed in order to like save the world? That like you keep talking about how
So,
like
I would
renewable
say-
energy is the only way, but what if it's a
Hold on.
250%
I would
increase in renewable
say
energy?
that as climate change gets worse, there is more manifestations of the harms, like more extreme weather events, which means if we can slow down the progress, it means that at least in the short term
Yeah,
or in the long term, we're saving a lot of
but
lives.
what we would contend
secondly,
is that because the baseline usage of renewable energy is already so low, a 70% increase
that's
is
not,
no,
it's
it's
not a
70%
70% increase, 70% transition. So 70% of energy
the
is
world's
yeah,
energy is going to
exactly.
be renewable energy.
Yeah, I think you misunderstood.
Yeah. Do you have a question? I can
Yeah.
answer your question.
Yeah, sure. So you would agree that more data for the government to pull from has its harms, like its potential
I
threats.
mean,
right?
no, we don't agree with that.
Wait,
because-
you tell us right now that there's so many like large-scale surveillance programs.
Yeah.
Yes,
Like-
and that's harm. That like that could be harmful because it's talking about personal data. It's about like things that you say. It's your text messages.
What
it's
is
things
what
that
is
you
more
do.
personal than your health records?
I mean, so how does
Like
that,
literally,
how
like
does
outside of my
how do
social
your health
security, the
records
last thing I would want
stop
someone to
you-
see is like my
But
health
how
records.
does that stop you from speaking out? A dissenter won't speak out because they fear that like they're like what they say is going to be like there's going to give me some sort of retribution from the government.
Yeah,
But
we-
how does your
we agree,
healthcare
that's the
record?
chilling effect.
Yeah,
That's
but
what we
how?
talk about.
Right, but you're not monitoring speech with IoT, which means that the chilling effect
Yes,
doesn't
you
have to
can.
do with
Yeah, you
speech.
can.
You can measure on interactions
So-
in a more accessible
So
fashion.
is it
How?
easy? Is it
Because of more data connections, that's what we're
But what is
looking
that
at.
data? You're telling me that that data is about healthcare.
No,
How
no,
does
no,
that-
it's not
you
just
tell us
healthcare.
it's about healthcare. Like
Yeah.
the idea is that right now the government has its barriers to surveilling its people.
At the end of the
And
day-
then at the end of the day, when you get access to one device in the Internet of Things, you get access to the entire web of data, which you guys never contest on an actual link level, that we are stepping into this overarching web of data that creates profiles for everyone.
Okay.
Bro, you got a minute 15.
Alright. So it's gonna be like Wang / their only contention, and then there's gonna be just like my case. Okay. So is everyone good?
Say one more time, sorry.
And I'm gonna start on their case, mostly at the impact stuff on the bottom.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I'm gonna move on to my case. I'll signpost with my case. Okay, so is everyone ready? Okay. Start off with their case where they try to link through an increase in autocracies through surveillance. First, they don't quantify to you how much worse this is going to get. Secondly, they don't prove to you that like we have anything. We've already reached the bright line to increase autocracies because we have like NSA metadata surveillance and surveillance of much more intimate personal data. Thirdly, this like that means that their argument is one, completely non-unique, but two, they don't show you the bright line. If anything, you turn the impact. Because the economist writes that if you have democracies in developing countries, if anything, they just elect demagogues that harms progress. When you have autocracies like China, they're able to invest all their resources towards industrialization, which pulls millions of people out of poverty. That actually empirically helps the bottom percent of people too. Industrialization helps everyone, not just the wealthy. But if anything, like these autocracies have a greater incentive to help their citizens, have a greater incentive to try to stop climate change. Like China has more green energy than we do, because when China sees that like mass amounts of people are dying from climate change, then people rise in rebellion and fight back against them. So if anything, this is an impact on the vote for us after this like increased autocracy. But their second thing is they're going to extend this weird term to our healthcare insurance thing about how like you discriminate against poor people. But even this Gilman analysis that says it's only being used against the rich. So we fight the Gilman analysis, doesn't apply to the poor, drop their term. But this one's like the only thing that actually matters, which is first contention like renewable energy. We tell you from the Japan Times that the only way to in the long term sustainably reduce climate change or to at least stymie its effects is through a transition to renewable energy, which we say in the status quo is impossible because it costs too much. The reason why it costs too much is because a sudden increase in the power of sunlight can cause mass amounts of grid malfunctions that cost $10,000 for every single second it occurs. But we have IoT devices that allow these risks to become smarter to shut itself off and stop stop the intake of sunlight when it becomes too much, we see that there's a $500 million in savings empirically in Italy. They say that how much of these devices are always on. Who cares if they're always on if they're using renewable power rather than fossil fuel power? That's really important. But please tell you that because empirically there's a 500 million reduction in cost, we see that by 2025, 70% of the world's energy will transition towards renewables. They say that we don't show you that we're going to solve climate change, but firstly, even we say that this is probably going to solve it because 70% is a lot of reduction. Secondly, is the try or die. If we don't try at all, we're never going to solve it. But thirdly, at least we can slow down the effects and prevent less hurricanes, less tsunamis from happening in the future. So for these reasons, we strongly urge you to affirm.
Con, you got a minute 10. That's time.
So it's going to go some terminal defense on their first contention and then back to our case. Judges ready? Opponents? Breach. Really quickly on renewable energy, a couple of key responses that go drop by the affirmative. The first comes from Energati, which Harish extends in a summary that says that since these devices are always on, we will see an unprecedented increase in energy consumption. The second comes from Cathcart, which also goes drop by the affirmative that says that any significant decreases in energy output will be offset by the flooding of the market of billions of new devices. He finds that on net, we will see an increase in dirty energy consumption. Even more so, they never show you that the increase in renewable energy usage actually crosses a meaningful bright line in which we start to save the world and start to undo global warming. At that point, they have no unique offense and no inherent reason to vote for them. But here's an inherent reason to negate, and it's that private eyes are always watching you. Recognize that they never respond to the framework we give you at the top of our case that says that you weigh democracy above all. At that point, the only way that you can affirm is by showing that the IoT actually improves democracy. Insofar as they fail to do that at any point throughout this round, you have to default to negative. But let's talk about why the Internet of Things actually worsens democracies. The first comes from Ferguson, who says that IoT inherently creates an inescapable web of data. They never contest this on a link level. They then say, we never quantify for you how bad the IoT is, but that's what the Baldini analysis does, which says that 90% of the world's data has been created in the past 2 years alone. That's more data, which we both agree in Grand Crossfire is only used by the government to oppress their people. And then he says that we have no uniqueness, showing why the IoT is uniquely bad. The problem is, again, we give you this in case from the Ernst & Young analysis that says that it's like the Three Musketeers, where it's all for one and one for all. You only need access to one device in order to get access to all the devices. That's an unprecedented amount of access for the government. And what Rosemary finds is that in the face of dissent, governments step up their surveillance, which is problematic because Stuy finds that when you increase surveillance, that only has a suppressing effect on minority opinion, which allows the majority to continue to perpetuate abuses against them. Even more so, what Varshni finds is that surveillance strengthens authoritarian regimes, and that's problematic because he finds that authoritarian regimes inherently do not care about equality. That's problematic because that means authoritarian regimes won't use this technology for the greater good of the world. Even if smart grids are so great, they're not going to adopt them because they haven't adopted a post-material mindset in which they care about things that are going on outside of their borders. Even more so, this presents a transition to democracy in which we have the best chance at saving the world. Thus, I urge you to negate today's round.